All right, so moving right along here in Egyptian Myths and Mysteries, we're on lecture number 6, which is, let's see, the subtitle for it is The Influence of Osiris and Isis, Facts of Occult Anatomy and Physiology. Lecture number 6, given on September 8th, 1908. The thing I like about Rudolf Steiner is that you never know what the guy's going to say next. He constantly keeps you on your toes with one astonishing thought or idea after the next. And I think this is no less true for this chapter as it is for previous chapters in all of Steiner's books. He's very addictive for this reason. So last time we talked about how the sun withdrew from the earth and then the moon withdrew from the earth, taking the earth's calcifying, hardening, stiffening forces along with it. And we saw how Yahweh was one of the beings who remained behind when the sun withdrew from the earth, and then water formed, and Yahweh stayed behind, sending tone through the water, which formed the water. And the lower half of man was worked on by lower astral influences, whereas the higher half received the sun with its love on his upper half. So Steiner starts out this chapter by saying that it was absolutely necessary for the moon to withdraw from the earth to take the stiffening forces with it, because the whole problem of evolution at this point was that let's say if man had if the human had only remained under the influence of sun forces and there were no moon forces at all, let's say only sun forces, then the sun would have sped up the metamorphoses of his evolutionary process to such a tempo that he would not have been able to keep up with it. He would have been rapidly transforming and metamorphosing. The whole evolutionary process would have been on fast forward. So it would have gone too fast. So it was necessary for the moon there. But if we blink out the sun and only the moon had acted upon him, then he would have hardened and stiffened. Right from birth, he would have come out and just stiffened right up like a mummy. So it was necessary that the moon withdrew to take the surplus of stiffening, calcifying forces along with it, so that there's a balance. Man is caught between the tension between sun and moon and these two evolutionary principles, which make his evolutionary process endurable and at a pace that he can keep up with. So he says that also, we saw how last time I rejected this idea that Osiris was a sun god. He absolutely is not. He's a moon god, which is why he's chopped into 14 pieces. And thankfully, Steiner recognizes that in this chapter by saying that though Osiris began as a sun god and the light that was streaming down on man was the light of Osiris streaming down on him, when the moon left, Osiris went with it, along with Yahweh. Osiris actually withdrew along with the moon, and then Steiner says it became the task of Osiris to reflect the sunlight from the moon and bounce it back to the earth. So that becomes his task. So thankfully, Steiner shifts him from the role of a sun god to a moon god, which in a way parallels the original misunderstanding in scholarship of Osiris as a sun god to his proper place as a moon god. So in a way, he did shift from the sun to the moon, even in our scholarship. So Steiner's myth sort of, in a way, unconsciously or naively reflects that shift. But nonetheless, so then he says, it occurs to me that some of you might not know the myth of Osiris and Isis, and maybe we should recount it briefly here before proceeding. The myth is that in the primordial time, the earth was just this watery abyss called Nun, which was a goddess, Nun, and a primeval mound came up out of it, and on that mound was sitting the god Atum, A-T-U-M. He's in the pyramid texts quite a bit, and he sits on the mound and he masturbates. From his semen, he rubs it in his hands, mixes it with some dirt, and creates the first primordial pair, Geb and Nut. Geb is the earth god, Nut is the sky goddess, and here the Egyptians have reversed, or let's say, the Greeks will later reverse this to Uranos and Gaia. Uranos, the sky, is masculine. Gaia, the earth, is feminine. And also in Mesopotamia, too. The same valency. Kai, the earth, is the mother. And the heaven, On, A-N, is masculine, the sky god. Egypt is relatively unique in assigning the earth a male valency. Geb, the earth god, who's also, like Poseidon, the god of earthquakes, and the sky goddess Nut, who is linked with the Milky Way, the heavenly Nile. She's the Milky Way. That's why she's the sky as a goddess. And so the two are mating, and then they produce Shu and Tefnut, another pair. Shu is male, and he is the god of the atmosphere, the air, and she is the goddess of moisture, which is why the atmosphere pushes up the ceiling of the world. And this is why you see in later, very late Egyptian representations in the New Kingdom of Jeb holding, or rather Shu holding his mother Nut up away from Jeb, who's laying on the ground with one knee upraised. That knee represents the primordial mound of Atum, and also the pyramids will later be signified by the knee of Jeb. So they're separated, and they have already produced, however, their offspring, which is two brother-sister pairs, Osiris and Isis on the one hand, Nephthys and Set on the other. Isis and Nephthys are funerary deities. Nephthys is associated with the watery abyss, and Isis with the throne, the upper world and the underworld. And they are always put at the head and feet end of the coffin, respectively. So Osiris makes the mistake one night of sleeping with his brother's wife, they're both brother-sister pairs, since brother-sister incest was reserved as a prerogative for royalty in ancient Egypt. So he makes this mistake, and this pisses Set off. So Set decides that he's going to do away with him. So he does it in a special way where he holds this party where there is a beautiful coffin out on display, and he says anyone can have this coffin for their mortuary tomb when they die. Whoever can get into it, and it fits them perfectly. Everyone tries. It doesn't work on anyone until Osiris gets inside of it. He gets in it, fits him perfectly. He's like, hey! And then they slap the lid on, and they put 72 nails in it. Notice that the number 72 is linked with the precession of the equinoxes, since it takes 72 years for the precession to precess backwards by 1 degree of the zodiac. So it's a key number in the precession. And then they throw it in the river. He's put into the caskets, thrown into the river. It goes down the river, and it washes ashore, where a tree grows up over it and around it and encompasses it within. Isis goes out looking for him, and she can't find him. But one day a pharaoh is wandering by looking for a central pillar in his palace. He sees this beautiful, tall, spindly, perfect tree, and he says, hey, that'll work just fine. Take that down and let's put that in the palace. So they chop it down and they put it in his palace as the central pillar. Isis finds out about this somehow, possibly by word of mouth, and she puts herself in as babysitter for the king. And she's one night babysitting the child, and she's a goddess of immortality, so she decides to make the child immortal by putting him in the fireplace and burning away his mortality. The pharaoh happens to walk in at this moment, sees this going on, and says, you're fired, get out. She doesn't bother to explain that she's a goddess, but she says, I want that pillar. I'm happy to leave, but would you just give me the central pillar in your palace as a parting gift? For some reason, he agrees and gives her the pillar. She leaves and extracts the body of Osiris from it, puts him up on a table, gets up on him, cowgirl, rides him cowgirl, and produces Horus. So Horus is the god, the true god of the sun. Horus is the sun god, the falcon-headed sun god, who is then produced. One day, Set is out hunting boar in the swamps, and he finds the body of Osiris, and he's pissed off about it, so he chops it up into 14 pieces and scatters the 14 pieces to the winds. Isis then, meanwhile, has to go around and gather up each of the 14 pieces, which she puts into a basket, but she only finds 13 of them. The 14th is actually his penis, which is missing because it's been swallowed up by one of the fishes, which is an interesting thought with regard to the impregnation of the Magnus Annus that will later produce the Aeon of Christ with all the fish symbolism. It's as though the fish were pregnant with that. We're in the Aeon of Taurus, the bull here still, and we still have to go through the ram with the Greco-Roman before we get to the Christian fish Aeon, but nonetheless. So the pieces have been gathered up by Isis and sutured back together, and Horus has vowed revenge on his father's death to go fight his uncle. So Horus goes and does battle with Set. Set loses a testicle. Horus loses an eye. That eye, in some accounts, becomes associated with the moon, but the remaining eye is the eye of Horus, or actually the other way around. The eye that is lost becomes the eye of the sun that's fetched by Tot. And so you can find this eye, pick it up and hold it in your hand, and it's the power of the sun. and they shine it on the body of Osiris to resurrect him. So then he's reborn and becomes Lord of the Judge of the Dead in the underworld from that point on. So that's the basic myth. The key thing for this discussion of Steiner, he gets into occult anatomy and physiology here, which is very interesting. The number 14 is key because Osiris is divided into 14 pieces. And as I said last time, that's the key to understanding him as a lunar deity, because that's the half of a lunar cycle. And Steiner says, yes, that's exactly right. In this case, Osiris is now a moon god, and those 14 pieces refer to 14 days of a lunar cycle, specifically the waxing half that moves from new moon to full moon. Those 14 days are assigned to Osiris, but there's actually another set of 14 days then to get from the full moon back to the new moon, and those are under the charge of Isis. The two of them put together compose 28 days, of course. And he says that it's interesting that this corresponds to 28 nerve pairs going along the spinal column. There are actually 31. And he says, yes, I know there are more, but I account for the difference by the fact that there's a difference between the length of the solar year and the length of the lunar year, which I'll confess that I don't understand, because my understanding is that the solar year is 365 days and the lunar year is 354 days, which would be a difference of 11 days. So I'm not quite sure how to account for that difference between 28 and 31. But nonetheless, what's important is the 28 days of the moon cycle corresponding to these 28 pairs of nerves going down the spinal column. It's also interesting, Steiner doesn't mention this either, that the spinal column is also linked with Osiris by means of the raising of the Jed pillar. The Jed pillar is a symbolic spinal column that has 4 vertebrae on it, but which is meant to just be part for the whole, pars pro toto, as the whole spinal column. And there was a ceremony called the raising of the Jed pillar that was held, where the Jed pillar begins horizontally. That's Osiris dead. And then they raise it straight up, and that's Osiris resurrected. That's his spinal column, which, of course, is the axial pivot of man, just as the spinal column of the heavens is the pole star, which at that time was Thuban, the pole star, around which the stars never sat below the horizon and were there, swirled around it like swallows, swirled around it and never set below the horizon, and so they were called the deathless ones. And so Osiris was linked with that by means of the pole star, by means of his spinal column. Although, and again, Steiner doesn't mention this, Osiris was, of course, the constellation of Orion, which was called the Giant, but it was meant to represent Osiris, which, when it finally sets, takes 72 days for it to reappear. And so 72 days was the ideal period of mummification. It would take place over a process of 72 days to signify this. And of course, once it does rise, then Sirius trails after it, which is Isis. And this was important because it was linked with the heliacal rising of Sirius every July, which was timed perfectly for the flooding of the Nile, which was meant to represent the semen of Osiris flooding the land and impregnating it so the vegetation could come up. So Steiner says that, so we've got these 28 nerve pairs, and he says it's interesting that so they're assigned to the male half is Osiris, the female half is Isis. And he says that, now remember I said that when the moon withdrew from the earth, individuals were able to breathe. Now the humans were able to, they were able to breathe the air, and death came in. But now they had to die. But of course, you only have death when you have sex. The two are interconnected. And so he says that, so we have sex and death, and now coming in. And so what happens is that, and by the way, that there are 5 kingdoms in biology now. Steiner has the 4 kingdoms. He's got the physical body, the etheric body, the astral body, and the human as 4 separate kingdoms. And there used to be traditionally only 2 kingdoms, the plants and animals. Everything that was alive either fell under one or the other of those designations. But now we have 5 kingdoms in which we have bacteria basically as the first kingdom, and then which are non-nucleated, they're prokaryotes. And then we have eukaryotes with protists coming in who invent sex and therefore death. And then fungi, and of course plants and animals on top of that. So we have a 5 kingdom classification now. Minerals, of course, don't count as a kingdom in the biological world. So anyhow, getting back to Steiner then, so he says, now what determines the sexes, whether one is male or female, is the fact, and this is rather astonishing that he says this, is the fact that whether the 14 days of Osiris predominate or the 14 days of Isis predominate in an individual. And if it's the nerve centers that are linked with Isis, then the individual is male. If the nerve centers that are linked with Osiris predominate, then the individual is female. This is pretty interesting, actually. And he also says, in addition to this, that the etheric body of a man then is female, whereas the etheric body of a woman is male. He's already got Jung's idea of the contrasexual aspect of men and women. This is in 1908. This is like a decade before Jung puts forward his theory of anima and animus. It's not till after the break with Freud, after 1913, during his so-called period of the confrontation with the unconscious, that he works out this contrasexual theory that a man's psyche is female and contains an anima, whereas a woman's psyche is male and contains an animus. That's a later development. It's funny how Germans being the way they are, and I know Jung was Swiss, still German-speaking nonetheless, they're very territorial. As I did a series of Steiner being territorial with Spengler, someone at one point wrote a letter to Jung asking his opinion of Rudolf Steiner, and he said, I don't have the slightest use for him because they're too similar. They're too much alike. And Steiner wanted to be the big man sitting on top of the mound. He had an ego that was so out of control. This is Jung's shadow side. I've been studying him for a course that I've been working on. And I find him pretentious and bombastic and totally uninteresting and unlikable as a person. I think he was just a spoiled brat who got everything he wanted. That's my opinion of him as a person. The ideas, on the other hand, are another matter. The ideas are absolutely amazing and fundamental as far as they go. Another problem with Jung is that he never got outside the cave of the human skull. All gods and myths are projections from the human psyche. They have no ontological existence whatsoever. Whereas in Rudolf Steiner, Steiner broke through to a realization that there are other beings tuned to higher frequencies that live in higher dimensions that are really there. They're real. They're actual. They're not just projections out of a collective unconscious. So Jung has some very severe limitations. He works well for the study of myth and scholarship, but that's as far as he goes. I think Steiner is the man. I think he's much greater intellect, much more brilliant, and created a much greater and more interesting mythology and cosmology. So that's what determines whether a person is male or female. And then he moves further into occult anatomy and physiology, saying that the larynx is actually male and the lungs are actually female. So the larynx is assigned to Osiris and the lungs are assigned to the wings of Isis. And he says, and of course, both men and women have the 28 nerve pairs, and of course, both of them have lungs and larynxes. So we are contrasexual by nature. But he says that they have the offspring, Horus. Horus is their child. Horus refers to the heart that is protected by the wings of Isis, the lungs, whereas the voice box is Osiris. And I noticed that when I was looking this up to check some facts, that in belly dancing, there's a motif that the belly dancer can create called the wings of Isis, where she is able to make wings on her arms to work it into belly dancing. It's called the wings of Isis. I find that interesting. That's connected with specifically with belly dancing. So anyhow, so then Steiner's talking about the occult anatomy and physiology, and then he finishes by saying that with regard to the alphabet, now there are 26 letters in the alphabet, and he says with the alphabet, also this accounts for the difference between the influences of Osiris and Isis, since certain sounds, I presume he's referring to the vowels, come from the voice, whereas other sounds involve the breath of Isis. And of course, this is an easy thing to figure out if you say the vowel sounds, A, E, I, O, U, and Y, if you want to throw that in. They all come from the voice, whereas the consonants P, B, D, those are all coming from the breath. Breath modified by lips, teeth, and tongue. So one comes from, the vowels come from the voice box, the realm of Osiris, and the rest of the consonants come from the lungs, from the realm of Isis. And that's this lecture of Rudolf Steiner's astonishing imagination. He never fails. The guy never fails to astonish me. So we'll stop there with lecture number 6.